Yeah, I'll put myself on mute and then start off at right at 2 o'clock.
Okay, perfect.
Good afternoon, everyone. If one of you can just give me a quick thumbs up to let me know that you can hear me just clearly, that would be perfect. Awesome. Well, welcome to this session this afternoon. The topic of our session is enabling zero trust with identity-based microsegmentation. This session is presented by Castellan Information Security Services, which is a Winnipeg-based information security services provider, providing personnel, services, and products to secure your data and your information assets. This information session that we're presenting is being presented by Brian Dixon, who is one of our partners at Unisys Stealth. And Brian Dixon is a security architect with Unisys and has over 15 years of experience working in IT infrastructure, networking, enterprise security, and compliance. As a resident of Las Vegas for over 16 years, Brian has spent most of those years working in the casino, gaming, and compliance industries. And in his current role as global security architect, Brian employs network security and user behavior analytics to identify and analyze security risks across organizational infrastructures, securing access to data using concepts of data classification and least privilege. Brian is currently pursuing his master's in cybersecurity, and he maintains industry certifications including CISSP, PCIP, AWS Cloud Practitioner, CJIS Level 4, and CJIS LASO. Brian, it's good to have you here. I'll transfer it over to you to walk us through enabling zero trust with identity-based microsegmentation.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the introduction. Everybody can see the screen and I'm coming through okay? I'll take that as yes. So hello and good afternoon. As stated, my name is Brian Dixon with Unisys. And what I'm going to do today is go over enabling zero trust with identity-based microsegmentation. If there's any questions throughout the presentation, please utilize the Q&A in the webinar, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that might arise. I personally have been very intrigued with the way threats and threat actors have continued to evolve. And as organizations continue to grow and need to find more secure methods of protecting their infrastructure, we're seeing things like microsegmentation and zero trust, bringing that flexible yet secure method to protecting things like cloud, mobile devices, remote workforce, IoT, with an effort of ensuring the systems and applications are remaining secured. So I think we're all pretty familiar with the traditional ways which we have used to secure systems and devices, right? So most applications, most users, most devices, they have historically been on site or within what we call the company four walls. There was a perimeter firewall that typically exists and still does exist, which filters and protects inbound and outbound traffic across the devices in that corporate perimeter. But with this legacy type of setup, it's very common for threat actors to be able to circumvent these different security controls and specifically take advantage of things like lateral movement attacks to move across different subnets, VLANs, in order to gain access to devices and resources that are within your company infrastructure. So within the past few years, we've seen a strong move with companies migrating to the cloud and having things like multiple data centers, and then users that are not necessarily restricted or working within a legacy company environment. Also, given the global pandemic that has affected most of us globally, the need for securing devices that are now considered fully remote or controlling access to those resources using something like a user's identity has forced companies to implement newer and more effective methods to secure access across these different devices. So we're now accessing critical company resources and applications from many different locations. Legacy VPN and conventional segmentation technologies, they just no longer provide an effective way to control access and secure systems or critical resources that our employees need to access. So compared to conventional segmentation, microsegmentation allows organizations to create software-defined parameters around systems and devices and control who can access them based on an identity or something like a digital certificate. So if you have permissions to access a system or an application based on your identity, you are permitted to do so, but only over the port and protocol which has been defined. So what's powerful about this is that you cannot laterally move to other systems that you do not have specific permission to access. So that control really remains closer to the host and is specific to the identity of the user and or the device that is requesting the access. So a few primary concepts that will help understand what it means to be a zero trust environment. As I mentioned before, in the past few years, we've seen a shift in the resources moving out of the traditional or legacy security perimeter. As we now have evolved into an even more remote workforce, or people working more remotely than in an office location, we have to start thinking in terms of what these remote and non-logically connected devices are and start to treat those resources as untrusted. So what I've done is summarized a few of these talking points, which I'll cover here on this slide. So one of the main parts or points around being a zero trust environment is having flexible security. So this is going to be critical in any zero trust implementation, but even more so when you're talking about implementing a microsegmentation deployment. Security needs to be flexible, and your policies need to be able to adjust in real time to address changes in your device or user security behavior. Users and devices being remote have created a very fluid network infrastructure, which makes it possible for users to work remotely. Security policies should also be flexible and adjust to changes in device health, or if security concerns are found on a device which is connecting to your environment. Security should not be granted, and policies should not be left in a static configuration. So if a system or resource health or actions on a device change, your security policies should be able to adjust and modify access based on those changes. So for example, you have systems that are connected to your network, they're sending and receiving data, and their status has been verified and trusted. So they've been admitted to be able to access these different resources. So what happens if that device or that user no longer has the specific AV controls or other security controls that you have implemented as an organization? Or what if somebody's disabled them? So the thought with this is that since the health or the security protection of that specific device has changed, wouldn't it make sense that the access policies would also be adjusted in order to change what it can access based on the health at that specific point in time? The second main area is again, I think also very common to us. There's really no longer a true perimeter, network perimeter. Users are connecting from a variety of locations, and not all of those locations are considered safe. And most importantly, they're not always owned or fully controlled by your organization. So users are connecting from networks and locations that are not managed by your company. And it's going to be important to treat those connections as untrusted and to verify all requests before you grant access to any corporate or cloud resources. So we want to effectively create a security perimeter around each specific device, creating something like a security bubble around that device or host, and treating it as its own security perimeter. So you want to isolate it from being accessed or accessing resources and only allow it to gain access to different systems, different resources that it needs to connect to. So a way that you could enhance the security, for example, is installing a host-based firewall or a host-based IPS, for example, to give you those additional security controls. Another point is, especially with Zero Trust, you trust nothing and you verify everything. So all devices and users that connect to your resources, they should all be considered as untrusted. So trust should not be automatic, nor should it be considered implicit. So it should be earned based on the device and the identity of the person who is accessing a system or resource. So once a user or device is granted access to an environment, it's going to be critical that the level of trust be maintained. What that means is there should be systems in place that can monitor and allow for changes in the user device to be realized, like unauthorized elevated command attempts, malware, virus activity, or if you have user behavior monitoring systems in place, which can alert your policy infrastructure and adjust those zero trust policies in near real time. There are a few primary tenets for enforcing this type of adaptability, which we'll talk about on a future slide, and those are identify, control, analyze, and secure. So I just want to throw in a few statistics. I have two different statistics slides that I'll show. But what it is a number of reports have been collected to identify the changes in cybersecurity attacks and breaches now that many companies are struggling to handle the shift of users and devices that are connecting from any number of remote locations. So in August of 2020, a survey was done with 200 IT and cybersecurity professionals to identify the biggest shifts in how they manage security across devices, now that many of the devices are no longer within what they consider the traditional network perimeter. So since the start of the pandemic, it's estimated that around 20%, there has been a 20% increase in security breaches occurring due to the shift in remote workers, and specifically in the last few years or last year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So most organizations are understandably not prepared to shift into this remote workforce configuration overnight. So organizations have had to rely on legacy technologies like VPN, which we know is prone to lateral movement attacks, and legacy AV solutions that don't really provide the effective protection needed to secure resources or products that are located outside the traditional company perimeter. So at the time of this survey, around 45% of organizations questioned did not perform any additional security checks on devices that are connecting to corporate or cloud resources. Also, 44% did not provide any additional cybersecurity training or proactive security training to educate employees on safer computer and network security practices. So these are really some common and primary factors that any organization should follow, especially when securing systems and access to resources. So end users are one of the primary attack vectors. And as human error contributes to many of the security breaches that affect organizations today, it is even more critical to educate and ensure the users understand what they need to do to add into the layers of security that you're implementing across the organization. Most organizations that have been surveyed also agree that the work from home concept is not going away, and that changes to methods of securing devices access to resources, and supporting these remote workers is really going to be a priority, especially since users and devices are connecting to our corporate, our cloud, our enterprise resources from any number of what we would call unsafe locations, which virtually could be around the globe. So this isn't to say that companies aren't prepared to handle this remote workforce, but the sudden shift in the total remote workforce count versus having the majority of users and devices inside that corporate network has shifted to a point where legacy network and these legacy security solutions, they just no longer provide that adequate protection for the remote users and the remote devices. So likewise, this is another survey that was performed showing the technology gaps when it comes to users and devices working remotely. A financial services survey showed that the strong similarities across what most other industry verticals are facing, indicating the same types of technology and attack concerns when it comes to securing and protecting systems and those resources that no longer are considered inside that traditional perimeter. So being able to properly monitor and adjust security policies for devices that are behaving in an unsafe manner or that are accessing unsanctioned systems or resources is a critical component to organizational security. Not having this type of visibility and control can lead to ransomware, virus type attacks, and it can seriously affect an organization and its ability to do business. So when we're thinking about securing data across devices, we have to understand what the goal of most bad actors is. Well, they want to exfiltrate sensitive data or valuable data, or cause harm or disruption to a business or an organization in an effort to gain money or profit from something like a ransomware attack. Just think of the number of recent data breaches, specifically around organizations that have personal information or PII, or other types of sensitive data like HIPAA or credit card details. When we look at traditional security solutions, what we're seeing is these types of breaches happen. And it's really because these existing security solutions are just not effective in stopping data exfiltration and lateral movement type attacks. You couple that with the increase in remote workforce and the legacy access technologies like VPN or access to cloud resources. And you have a very complicated network environment with tools that are very siloed and that does not make it easy for IT organizations to effectively secure their infrastructure. So common threats like CryptoLocker or email threats like Emotet or phishing attacks, these all take advantage of trust relationships that exist within your organization. So these types of attacks, they grant bad actors access to the different systems, the different resources, and enable them to either laterally move throughout the organization or drop something like a remote access toolkit or some other backdoor application, which allows them to remain silent until sometime in the future when they start to attack or start to exfiltrate data or cause harm to your organization. Also, some common threats we've seen in supply chain attacks, which we've seen recently, take advantage of trust relationships that your organization has internally, but also with external parties that you do business with. Therefore, once these trust levels are established, it's critical that they be evaluated on a constant basis so that you can ensure that trust is not blindly maintained and that is adjusted based on the access criteria at that specific point in time. So trust between different channels and different applications within your corporate infrastructure or within your cloud organization need to be evaluated and dynamically adjusted based on the identity and the health of a particular system or resource at the point in time that that connection is actually taking place. So to address these types of attacks, organizations need to be able to adjust policies dynamically. So that means if I am going to connect to an IoT device from a management station or access a business critical application from a managed corporate device, the trust is evaluated at the point in time that I perform the connection. If at some point my device health or activity begins to decay or decline in quality, my security policy needs to adjust in order to secure and protect access to these different critical applications and therefore remove levels of trust. No longer thinking in terms of legacy protection, trust should no longer remain implicit. And just think about trust between you and a friend or between you and I on this conversation. Trust is earned. It's not automatic and it's not implicit. So trust can continue to increase based on the different behaviors and actions that we take. But trust can also be taken away in a heartbeat. For me, trust and security work in the same manner. Trust is earned based on the identity and the health of a system or a resource. Trust is not complete, nor again is it implicit. So trust levels can increase or decrease based on actions or health and statistics of any given resource or user that is connecting to the different systems in the organization. So this methodology just ensures that we are not simply granting unfettered access to our critical infrastructure without evaluating access and trust requirements over time. So these are a few zero trust principles that are intended to help organizations understand what needs to be evaluated prior to moving into a microsegmentation implementation. So first, you want to always identify who is accessing a resource. Associating access across an application or an infrastructure and tying that to a user or password, and then adding something like multi-factor authentication is going to demand that there's another level of validation before access is granted in that organization. Also, ensuring things like a secure password policy or ensuring you don't share passwords amongst users is going to add an additional layer of security and audit control around access in your environment. You want to always control who has access to what. So following the methodology of least privilege. So only grant access to users based on the least amount of privilege that they need in order to complete a specific job function. Things that I've seen actually put into use is don't copy permissions or rights or roles from one user to another. You want to grant permissions exactly to that specific user's requirements. You always want to analyze and understand what is happening in your organization, and especially in your IT infrastructure. And this is not always easy to do, but it's a critical step in order to become aware of what's happening in your IT environment. So if you don't know what's happening in your environment, how are you going to know what to protect against? So this is critical, especially with microsegmentation. I can monitor and inspect events and adjust security or access policies based on those specific events. And these things can be analyzed and collected in something like a SIM or some type of aggregation platform. Again, without this type of insight, I don't know what it is I'm trying to protect against and what policies I need to adjust. And then finally, you want to always secure. So you want to look at all of your devices as untrusted. You want to treat all users and all device connection attempts in the same way. So imagine that all your devices are external to your organization. And then take a look at your other access policies. And can those policies also be adjusted to follow the same least privilege model to help keep your systems and access channels secure? So in a typical organization, you're going to have a number of different communication flows, channels, and access requirements for your users and your applications so that everyone can do what their job requires. The common issue with legacy security solutions is that access based solely on a network segment or IP address is just not sufficient when you're trying to secure access to your different systems or resources across your infrastructure. Most importantly, there is no one size fits all when you're trying to restrict access and implement access requirements. Your users can be remote. They can be on-premise. These users can consist of standard power users. They can also consist of administrative users. So these systems, everywhere these people are, they're all interconnected. And the requirements for accessing the different systems, different resources, and performing elevated tasks, they can vary greatly based on who is performing that action. So putting all of these zero trust network access components into play, the goals are to secure access to systems and resources, not implicitly trusting any connection request, and not maintaining that level of trust without monitoring and maintaining security based on the access, the health and security, the integrity of that system or that resource. Aggregating data and information from your infrastructure at key collection points and from endpoints and user devices, for example, you can take that information, feed that into a SIM or another analytics platform, and then have an automation or orchestration platform or something like a SOAR to implement those adjustments to your zero trust and your security policies, which are in force across your organization. So this should be an ultimate end goal solution for many organizations to ensure that they're able to manage access and security policies in real time, adjusting policies based on events and behaviors that occur across the network and all related devices. So in addition, microsegmentation and zero trust allows organizations to focus on security. We aren't worrying about IP addresses and specific network segments or VLANs. Rather, we are now concerned with access policies that are based on identity or function, which can be dynamically adjusted with a user's group-based membership in something like Active Directory or Okta or Ping. Or it could be a certificate that is generated and assigned to a specific device. Access and controls can be adjusted using these methods in a dynamic manner. So this is going to ensure that companies can grant or remove access in real time, ensuring that they retain complete control over systems and resources that are now not considered within reach. And like we've discussed through this presentation, it is critical for organizations to gain visibility into their infrastructure in order to understand what they need to protect against. So if we don't know what's happening in our organization, how are we going to know what exactly we need to do and what policies need to be adjusted and what zero trust microsegmentation controls need to be enforced so that we can adjust controls based on security context, which is occurring throughout our infrastructure. Understanding the types of data, the types of workloads, all the user activities, what cloud access and what applications are being accessed, and the types of networks that are being accessed. How are users accessing and using the different applications and workloads that we're making available to them? Without this visibility, how can we learn to secure and enforce these security methodologies in order to protect our critical IT environments? These all play into types of access and control policies that need to be enforced when you are trying to secure access using concepts like zero trust and solutions like microsegmentation. Interestingly enough, many organizations cannot quantify the exact security metrics to understand and plan out their access and control policies. So that's why it's critical to have tools that provide visibility into the infrastructure across all different connection mediums. You may already have a number of security controls in place, but it's critical to make sure that these controls are properly implemented and that they are feeding data into a central analytics solution, again, like a SIEM, which can start to provide you the different levels of insight that are going to help ensure you have consistency across all the security in your organization. So siloed security tools, they cause headaches, and IT teams are already strapped. They've been strapped for years. So before you decide to move into a zero trust microsegmentation solution, it's critical to understand what tools you have, what the tools do, and how to make those tools more effective, so that when you do move into zero trust and microsegmentation, that shift and that process is effective and it keeps the information and the access policies properly defined. This is typically the most difficult step in this process, but the process results give metrics and security details that really help the business provide value and ROI so that you understand and prove what the security investment has actually provided. So zero trust models allow for organizations to secure systems and resources pretty much anywhere those systems reside. So this is increasingly more of a necessity now that you have your users and systems that require access and security on networks and infrastructure that your company doesn't even own. So think of the devices that are remote. And again, think about putting a security bubble as close to the host as possible to protect those systems. So as we're focusing on the security requirements for remote and on-premise devices, it's critical to understand what application and data resources are being accessed, starting from the host up through the private and public cloud. Most organizations have a very strong presence in the cloud and probably do not have a strong security policy around the data being accessed throughout the cloud. Being that cloud systems and cloud applications have a shared responsibility model, are you implementing the required and available security controls to complement the zero trust access methodology that you are looking to put in across your organization? Are the security controls enforced, or are they more in a monitor and alert mode? Do you have the tools needed to ingest, aggregate, audit, and analyze the access that's taking place across these environments? Malware and bad actors, they take advantage of weak security policies, which allow for them to laterally move or perform east-west communication channels, which are inherently trusted within a normal legacy segmented organization. This type of attack method and data exfiltration possibility needs to be mitigated. And the analytics that can detect poor behavior and dangerous behavior needs to take place so that again, you can dynamically adjust your different security policies to degrade or remove trusted communication channels and to stop the ability for the bad actors to exfiltrate data or spread malware throughout the environment. If something bad is happening, we should be changing our policies in real time to adjust to the new status of a health or connection from a device. And finally, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, with a zero trust security model, all devices, all users, and all connections should always be considered as untrusted. This means that remote users, your local office users, your administrative users, they're all considered remote and they're all treated in the same method in terms of trust. The device and the user must establish and prove trust. So that is taking the user ID, the password, and something like a multi-factor authentication method before your communication channels are established. Only then should these users be permitted to actually connect to the different resources or applications in your infrastructure. Now, again, trust should only be considered trusted until the device or the user behaviors change to a point where the trust policy needs to be adjusted. Trust is not implicit. It needs to not be static. Again, like earlier, trust is earned and maintained. If trust is broken or there is a degradation of trust across your user base or application, access needs to be degraded via the adaptive security policy we've talked about to ensure that users and devices are exhibiting unsafe behaviors if they are, and then they are prohibited from doing so in the future until that device health changes. Organizations use things like always-on VPN and other medium to connect users to corporate resources. Now, these connection types are not considered always secure. So you want to ensure you have policies that evaluate and validate a trust level and adjust that trust level adaptively during the connection lifetime, ensuring that you can proactively maintain security and adjust your policies in a manner that keeps your intellectual property safe. Now, as you start your journey to zero trust and eventually moving into microsegmentation, you need to know and understand what your blind spots are. You need to understand what the security gaps are, where you do or do not have adequate insight or controls around the different types of data and resources that you're trying to protect. Now, what things you do know and understand what things you don't know. You need to gain visibility so you can collect and aggregate data from all the different connection points within your organization. This would be users, devices, systems, resources, applications, and use that data to analyze and automate processes, again, to adjust your policies and your security controls that allow for access across your organization and across your cloud resources. You want to review that data. You'll start to understand that this data will then help you understand how secure you truly are. Again, trust is not implicit. So just because a device or a user has connected and trust was established at some point, it does not mean that that level of trust should apply in every scenario. Trust is earned. It does not remain static. So to my example earlier, trust is earned between people. I don't trust someone implicitly and then fail to evaluate that trust relationship after something has happened, especially something that might be negative. Trust can be removed much faster than it can be gained. So the sooner that you can identify and detect a security issue or a problem, the faster you're going to be able to adjust those security policies to ensure that data is protected and that access policies are adjusted to remove those trust channels until the security issues are remediated and that trust can be regained. The sooner we know that a change in trust or device security or behavior has occurred, the sooner we can adjust the security policies and remove or address the trust level. And then finally, again, monitor, analyze, and learn. You want to understand what's happening in your environment. You can't protect what you don't know, and you can't protect against things that you're not aware of. One of the key tenets to zero trust network access is the monitoring, analyzing, and understanding what is happening across your security controls. Use of this information gives organizations the power to adapt their access and their control policies dynamically, ensuring that access is permitted in situations where the trust exists. If device health changes or systems exhibit signs of malware or bad actor behaviors, this data should feed into their SOAR or their aggregation platform or other orchestration platforms so that trust and security policies can be adjusted to meet the access requirements at that specific point in time. I think one of the most cumbersome tasks is having to reevaluate security information over and over again, especially when that information is siloed and when it's not easily aggregated across your different security tools. So analyzing and monitoring all the data and using that data to then adjust and control your access policies is going to make your zero trust and microsegmentation journey that much more effective and keep your environment secure. And with that, I will conclude my presentation, and we welcome you to submit any questions here in the chat, or you can email us directly at the email on the screen. And I appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks for your presentation, Brian.
Yes, sir.
We do have a few questions that have come in so far. So maybe we have some time to address those. Here, let me just go down the list here. First question, what are the challenges of deploying zero trust in an organization?
So I think from experience, the biggest challenges are organizations typically have a fear of moving away from legacy or traditional security methods that they've done for many, many years. And I think when we talk to organizations about zero trust, like I've mentioned throughout the conversation, it's really just understanding what you have in place, what the security controls are currently doing, and then understanding the different levels of access that are needed across all the different users, applications, and resources that are in your organization. Because just to throw in a zero trust architecture, there's a lot of considerations that have to be, thought of in advance. Understanding what the different user groups are, where the permissions are going to come from, and really what you're going to do to architect that zero trust methodology so it's truly as zero trust as possible.
Okay, thanks for that. Here's another question. To implement a zero trust architecture, do you need to get rid of the network security appliances such as firewalls and IPSs?
So, in personal opinion, so I don't think if you're talking about a traditional perimeter environment, so like a traditional corporate environment, a perimeter firewall device and a perimeter IPS, that should always be in place. I don't think those should ever go away, because zero trust can apply to many different applications. But if you have standalone devices, those still need to have some type of perimeter effect or security methodology in effect to secure those devices that can't really participate in true zero trust. But for most organizations with people working remotely, or most organizations having a cloud presence, I think that you can leverage some of those zero trust methodologies and not worry so much about true perimeter when it comes to cloud, because you're letting the hosts really control the methodology around who can access what versus having a perimeter device then grant access to those different resources. So it just depends on exactly what the environment is. But in a traditional perimeter environment, I would definitely agree you should maintain an IPS and a firewall. But then as you get to the remote stuff and the people working out of office, I think you can start to leverage some of the technologies that grant you this flexibility and that's more host-based control.
Okay. Next question. How is disaster recovery planning affected if zero trust is deployed?
Well, I think that your disaster recovery and your DRP and all the different backup methodologies should be one and the same, right? So you should have your backup methodologies to ensure you have accurate backups if you're talking about data security and data retention and data restoral. If you're going to be implementing a zero trust architecture and you have a DR site, making sure you obviously test those. And if you're going to carry that into the DR, making sure that the zero trust architecture works in that methodology. But I think it's the same methodology as with legacy security in that case. You want to make sure that you test backup, backup, test, restore, and that you have the same access validated across both environments. I don't think it really changes the way you should be performing or implementing backups or restores and tests. It's just the different methods that are used to then gain access to that data.
Okay. And next question, is it possible to deploy microsegmentation for legacy systems?
It is actually. So depending on the product and the vendor, I kept the presentation pretty agnostic, but working for Unisys, we have our Stealth product line, and I believe there's some other vendors that have talked about zero trust. So it depends on the product vendor, but there are some methodologies around securing legacy systems. So for example, Unisys Stealth approaches that using a secure virtual gateway, which is it can be an appliance or a virtual machine that sits in front of that network segment or that device if it's not supported by an installable agent. And it provides basically it's a gateway that provides access to and secures access to legacy systems. Most vendors that are playing around in this space or that have products in this space, they're going to be probably supporting anything back to the most current, like supported Windows operating system. So Windows 7 and forward, for example, Server 2008, R2 and forward, those types of environments. So if you start getting into 2003 and Windows XP, depending on the vendor, but most will have some type of gateway interface to be able to secure and get that zero trust architecture extended to legacy devices.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I think this next question kind of ties into a couple of the ones that we've already asked. What type of an organization is an ideal candidate for implementing zero trust and microsegmentation? And then they've given a couple of different scenarios. Someone with technology no later than 10 years and a hybrid of cloud deployments, or purely cloud or purely on-prem, relatively new technologies.
That's actually a really good question. The response is just going to be based off of preference and what I've noticed working for in this specific field for a while. It really just depends on the level of comfort that the organization has implementing this type of technology. So we have seen in terms of not just the examples given, but in terms of big companies, small companies, different verticals, we really have seen this adapted and implemented across all different scenarios. We see customers that have pure cloud deployments, and this type of infrastructure is easier for them because they don't have to worry about any of these complex security tools that you would have to try to deploy using legacy, type firewall and type IPS solutions. But we also have customers that have a hybrid, and they have manufacturing companies that have very old manufacturing machines running XP, or they have PLCs and different controller devices that are running proprietary operating systems. So actually, I mean, I don't want to say it's kind of fit for all, but we've seen a lot of companies really just across all scenarios. If they're trying to get towards a zero trust and a segmentation approach, that this really just kind of fits nicely in a lot of different scenarios. So I would say kind of all the above.
Okay, all right, that sounds good. I think that was our last question that's been submitted to us.
Cool.
Thanks very much, Brian, for the presentation. And since I don't see any other questions coming in, I think we're okay to wrap up this session. Thanks everyone for attending this session as well. We really appreciate your time. And thank you, Brian, for the presentation as well.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.